The story of Happiness in Betsy is obviously a very tragic one, but gives you a glimpse of the reality that many people out there are facing.
Yeah, Garth and I were chatting just before we came on here, and it's probably one of the most powerful intros that we've ever read, is the idea that somebody had to borrow money to buy rat poison so that they could kill themselves. I mean, that's just tragic in so many levels. And what I thought was interesting, we're obviously aware there's a growth in the unsecured lending market, which is starting to talk about bubbles and that kind of thing. But we very often don't bring that back to the individual. We don't talk about what's the impact on low-end South African, middle-class South African, even the high-end South African, in terms of what their debt situation. And I thought what Bruce did very nicely with this cover story was he took the human element to it, and he also talked about the industry that had developed around it. You talk about your lawyers, your debt collectors. We've all got stories about debt collectors from City of Joburg, or the SABC in my case, chasing down your TV license. And it's such an aggressive industry, and I think it's one of those things where you really battle to get out. Simon Mantell is quoted in the story essentially as saying that this whole industry has grown into a multi-billion rand collection industry, chasing people who owe debt and should never have been granted that credit in the first place. Scary stuff.
And of course, the macroeconomic environment with interest rates at record lows not helping either, with consumer inflation this week coming down to 4.9%, opens up again for another interest rate cut in South Africa. And of course, we're trying to stimulate the economy, but at the same time forgetting the impact that it's having on your lower LSM, people who are taking advantage of that and borrowing beyond their capability.
Well, I think the thing is, record low interest rates aren't going to help you when financial institutions can charge up to 30% and above for these unsecured loans. And that's kind of the point I think we've been trying to get across. People have been saying there's no bubble in the unsecured lending space, but they're looking at it from the bank's perspective, because it makes up about sort of between 8 and 10% of their lending book. So for the banks, it's not a problem if they suddenly have a sharp rise in defaults in that unsecured part of their lending book, which is only 8%. But for ordinary individuals earning 8,000 rand a month, working as truck drivers or bakers, etc., that can really ruin your life. And I think one of the stats in Bruce's story is almost 50% of South Africans I think already have impaired credit records. And we're sitting in the wake of a global debt crisis, and South African financial institutions are trying to tell themselves debt's not a bad thing. It's a terrible thing if you can't pay it.
Is this a tragedy worth waiting to happen, Louise?
Well, from our perspective, we run pro bono law clinics, so we're dealing with really low income consumers. The threshold for being able to obtain pro bono assistance is 7,000 rand gross monthly household income a month. So it's really this exact group of people that we're dealing with. And we're seeing so many people come to our consumer protection law clinics looking for assistance with these very issues, that of reckless credit that should probably never have been loaned to them, and then ending up in a deduction from their salary that they just can't afford.
But what about NCA, National Credit Act? Why is this not having any traction?
I think there's a couple of aspects to it. I mean, remember what happened pre-NCA and what's happened post-NCA, but you've got to understand that we looked at African Bank recently, and you can see where the growth is. These are people who can, in theory, afford it, if you take just if you just use the payslip method, but you don't look at whatever else is being lent around it. And I think that's where the issue is starting to come in, is that it's not being treated. It's simply saying, well, if your payslip says you earn X, that's all I'm interested in. I'm not interested in what else you might be owing. You might owe 8,000 rand and earn 7,000, but it doesn't matter because your payslip says 7,000.
The aggression of debt collectors, and Mark, you alluded to it earlier, it is terrifying when you get that phone call, be it on an SABC license. You do think that the world is going to come to an end. So somebody who isn't attuned to handling that kind of aggression, it could have a calamitous effect, as it did have on Happiness and Betsy.
Well, I mean, another interesting point from Bruce's story is it's quite tough for the guys making the phone calls, trying to collect the debt as well. Apparently, in that job, working in a call center, phoning people up every day, trying to get them to pay their debts. Apparently, the maximum people last on average is about 3 years. So it's a very aggressive industry by its very nature. Louise was telling us earlier on that a lot of times, people coming to their law clinic are saying, well, where is this 374 Rand coming from that's coming off my bank account every month? They don't know where it's coming from because often they aren't aware of the garnishing order that's been attached to their salary. So obviously they get a call out of the blue saying, you owe X amount of money, and the default reaction is to probably get angry. So it's a
It's a
sounds
tough
like a
industry
messy
both
business.
ways.
I mean, an interesting stat that Bruce had, MBD, which is actually owned by Transaction Capital, R1 million an hour is what they're chasing in terms of collection. I mean, that's a frightening statistic.
Are people reaching out? You refer to, obviously, your law clinic. Are you inundated with people crying out for help?
We have definitely seen an increase in people coming through to our law clinics, but I think that's a very important point. So there's a massive responsibility on the part of the consumer, and that's where we're seeing the gap. The consumer, obviously the relationship is not equal. The debt collector comes, as you say, with this aggression, knowing the law, saying you have to pay, this is where you have to pay. But there's no empowerment on the part of the debtor to say, hold on a second, I don't have to sign acknowledgements of debts with things left blank, with interest rates of 60%. The responsibility of the consumer to actually become empowered is what's going to change this situation.
Garth, you wanted to add?
No, I was just, it sort of brings us to the next thing that we were due to talk about and how people manage their finances. On the one side, it is education. On the other side, I think in South Africa, behavior is a very important thing. People, unfortunately, just have to learn methods to sort of live within their means.
Mark, in terms of the takeaway piece from Bruce, and of course we refer to Bruce as though he's here. Bruce Whitfield, we are talking about the renowned Bruce Whitfield. He would like that. He's on holiday at the moment.
Absolutely.
I hope you can see that quote coming through. The takeaway from the cover story here.
One, I think that there's a very real problem there. I think we always sort of talk this high-end view of the unsecured lending. Is there a bubble? Isn't there a bubble? The bubble is somebody borrowing money to buy rat poison to kill themselves. And it sounds terrible and it sounds totally insensitive. But the reality is that debt isn't just a number. It actually comes back to individuals. And there is a very real problem out there in the consumer in South Africa at the moment. And it's being fueled by the fact that there are no jobs out there. No jobs means there's no way to pay back that salary, and there's an industry as soon as a bank is no longer able to collect on it, it simply hands it over to lawyers or people who pretend to be lawyers, and they then just this industry is booming around the fact that people shouldn't have this credit in the first place, shouldn't have been lent this credit in the first place, and now they're being forced to repay it.
A quick one, Louise, in terms of a final word to viewers watching this show today.
I think the basic thing to know is that if you have an employee who might have some kind of garnishee or emolument order coming off their salary, empower them. I know it's difficult to step into the private life of employees and people that you may know, but they don't have to have that deduction coming off their salary. There's ways to have it lowered. There's ways to check. Possibly the whole thing's been paid off and they're still paying it because there's some kind of administrative fault. So empower the people around you and let them know that they do have rights in this situation.
Thanks so much for your time, Louise. Big thank you, public interest lawyer at Worksman's Attorney.